Welcome to today's incredible story, where a millionaire husband makes the worst decision of his life. After 15 years of marriage, he throws his devoted wife out to bring home his young mistress. But karma is relentless, and months later, he's left speechless when fate delivers a shocking twist. Stay with us to witness the jaw-dropping downfall of a man who thought he had it all. Your support fuels these compelling stories. So if you're as invested as we are, let us know in the comments. Just hours ago, Julia Carter had been finalizing plans for her 15th wedding anniversary. Now, she stood in shock, watching her world collapse around her. "Daniel, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "What's happening? Talk to me." But Daniel Carter, a wealthy real estate mogul, didn't even meet her eyes. His face was stone cold as he stormed back into their lavish mansion, emerging moments later with an armful of her clothes. Without hesitation, he tossed them onto the growing pile on the driveway. 15 years, Julia," he shouted, his voice filled with resentment. 15 years of trying and nothing. You couldn't give me the one thing I need, an heir to my empire." Julia staggered back as if she had been struck. The words cut deeper than any blade. She and Daniel had tried for years, enduring countless fertility treatments, each failure leaving her heart in pieces. But she had always believed that love would be enough, that Daniel had understood. As his furious tirade continued, her mind drifted back to happier times. Their wedding day, his eyes full of love as he promised to stand by her side forever. Their first anniversary on a secluded beach, dreaming of the family they would build together. The night his first big real estate deal came through, and they danced in their tiny apartment, overwhelmed with hope for the future. Now, those moments felt like someone else's life. "Daniel, stop!" Julia cried, reaching for his arm. "We can fix this. We always have." But he jerked away as if her touch burned him. "There's nothing to fix, Julia. It's over." Before she could process his words, the sound of tires crunching against the gravel echoed through the stormy night. A sleek black sports car pulled up. The door swung open, and out stepped Madison Hayes, Daniel's young assistant. Julia's stomach twisted as she saw the smug glint in Madison's eyes. "Daniel, baby," Madison called out in a saccharine voice, walking toward him with confidence. "Everything okay? I got worried when you didn't show up for our dinner." Julia's world tilted. "Dinner?" she whispered, glancing between her husband and his mistress. Daniel's face hardened. "Madison is pregnant, Julia," he declared, his voice devoid of remorse. "She's giving me what you never could." The words stole the air from Julia's lungs. She felt the weight of betrayal crush her, drowning out the storm raging around her. Madison's voice dripped with artificial concern. "Daniel, is everything okay? I was worried when you didn't show up for our dinner." Julia felt the ground shift beneath her. Dinner? Her eyes darted between Daniel and Madison, searching for any sign that this wasn't real. Daniel's expression hardened. "Madison is pregnant, Julia," he stated, his voice cold and unyielding. "She's giving me what you never could." The words struck like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Julia swayed slightly, gripping the edge of her coat to steady herself. "You and her?" she choked out. "How long?" Daniel smirked. "Long enough." Madison, emboldened by Daniel's presence, stepped closer, looping her arm around his. Her manicured hand rested possessively on her still flat stomach. "Don't worry, Julia," she purred. "I'll take good care of him and our baby." Something inside Julia shattered. The love she had fought for, the life she had built, it had all been an illusion. With trembling hands, she gathered the rain-soaked clothes Daniel had thrown at her. She was shaking, but not from the cold. "You will regret this, Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "One day, you'll realize what you've thrown away." Daniel didn't even flinch. He simply turned his back, leading Madison into the warmth of the house. Their house. The mansion that had once been Julia's home. She stood motionless, staring at the glowing windows, a cruel contrast to the freezing darkness surrounding her. For a fleeting moment, she considered begging, fighting for another chance. But then, something stronger stirred within her, anger, determination, and something else she couldn't quite name. With a deep breath, Julia turned away. She had no idea where she would go, what she would do next, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't stay here, clinging to the shattered remains of her marriage. As she stepped onto the muddy driveway, her designer heels sinking into the earth, she placed a hand on her stomach. A wave of nausea hit her. Stress or something else? She didn't know. But in that moment, a tiny spark of hope flickered inside her. Her life would never be the same. Daniel Carter sat in his high-rise office, the New York skyline stretching before him, his empire gleaming under the city lights. Yet, his mind was elsewhere, tangled in memories he had spent years trying to bury. He was a child again, sitting in the backseat of his parents' car. They were laughing, discussing his upcoming birthday. Then, screeching tires. A blinding light. Silence. Daniel blinked, forcing himself back to the present. That night had changed everything. One moment, he had a family. The next, he was alone, thrust into the cold, unforgiving world of St. Mark's orphanage. Life at the orphanage had been brutal. Daniel learned quickly. Vulnerability was a weakness he swore he would never have again. That night had shaped Daniel Carter's entire existence. He had learned the hard way that vulnerability was a weakness, something people could exploit. He built walls around his heart, swearing never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. As he grew older, that determination hardened into an obsession. He excelled in school, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university, where he discovered two things: his raw talent for real estate and his insatiable hunger for success. Straight out of college, Daniel landed an entry-level position at a mid-sized real estate firm. He worked tirelessly, often crashing at his desk, driven by the fear of failure. His ruthless ambition didn't go unnoticed. The firm's owner, an industry veteran, took him under his wing, molding him into a powerful real estate mogul in the making. But it was during this mentorship that Daniel made his first ethically gray decision. A struggling family was on the verge of foreclosure. Instead of offering them options, Daniel saw an opportunity. "We can flip this property fast," he told his boss. "The profit margin is too good to pass up." The deal went through. The family lost their home. Daniel pocketed his first real win. The guilt gnawed at him, but the thrill of victory drowned it out. He quickly learned to push aside the faces of those he displaced, replacing them with numbers on a balance sheet. Success followed him like a shadow. Soon he met Marcus Bennett, a sharp young attorney with an unwavering moral compass. Despite their different outlooks, they became close. Marcus often tried to be the voice of reason, challenging Daniel's more ruthless instincts. "Daniel, we can't do this," Marcus argued one afternoon, waving a thick file in frustration. "This deal will ruin these people. They'll lose everything." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's just business, Marcus. If we don't do it, someone else will." "That doesn't make it right." Daniel didn't answer. He was already walking away, his mind on bigger things. He had an empire to build. Years passed, and Daniel's empire expanded. He founded Carter Developments, quickly becoming one of the most influential figures in the New York real estate market. His methods weren't always ethical, but they were undeniably effective. He had a knack for exploiting loopholes, applying pressure in the right places, making obstacles disappear. With each deal, the walls around his heart grew taller. On the surface, he had it all: money, power, respect. But when the city slept, when the noise faded, and he was left alone with his thoughts, something dark gnawed at him. It was during one of those silent moments that Daniel Carter had met Julia when he least expected it. She wasn't like the women he usually encountered, shallow, self-serving, always chasing power. Julia was different. She was kind, genuine, with a warmth that had melted the defenses he had spent years building. For a while, Daniel allowed himself to believe. Maybe, just maybe, with Julia, he could finally have the family he lost all those years ago. Maybe she could fill the void inside him. But as the years passed and Julia failed to conceive, those old fears returned. The deeper connection he once craved now terrified him. He couldn't afford vulnerability. It was easier to retreat behind his fortress of wealth and power, easier to convince himself that his real estate empire was all that mattered. Sitting alone in his office, Daniel stared at the framed wedding photo on his desk. He and Julia, frozen in time, smiling as if they truly believed in forever. He remembered the hope he felt that day, the promise of something different. A life filled with love, not just ambition. With a swift motion, he knocked the frame face down. That man was gone. He had sacrificed too much to let emotions stand in his way. His empire was his legacy, and he wouldn't let anyone, not even Julia, threaten that. The sharp buzz of the intercom pulled him from his thoughts. "Mr. Carter, your 2 o'clock is here." Daniel straightened his tie, forcing his face into the mask of confidence he wore so well. "Send them in." Later that evening, Daniel swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand as he lounged on his leather chair. Across from him, Madison reclined on the couch, her hand resting lightly on her barely visible baby bump. "We should start looking at schools," she mused, scrolling through her phone. "Only the best for our little heir." Daniel nodded, a smug smile curling at his lips. Of course, nothing but the finest for my child. This was what he had always wanted, an heir to his empire, someone to carry on his legacy. With Madison, everything seemed to be falling perfectly into place. "We should celebrate," Daniel declared, setting down his glass. "Dinner at La Belle tonight?" Madison's eyes gleamed. "Perfect. I'll wear that new dress you bought me." As they reveled in their luxury across the city, Julia Carter was facing a very different reality. The harsh fluorescent lights of the women's shelter flickered above her as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thin mattress beneath her did little to cushion the cold, hard floor. The muffled sobs of another woman in the next cot filled the quiet night. How had she ended up here? Just days ago, she was living in a mansion, attending charity galas. Now, she had nothing. The thin mattress barely cushioned Julia Carter from the hard floor, and the quiet sobs of the other women in the shelter filled the air. Just days ago, she had lived in a mansion, attending charity galas, wrapped in the illusion of security. Now she was homeless, penniless, and completely alone. Her hand drifted to her stomach, a habit she had unconsciously developed over the past few days. Something felt different, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. The next morning, after a meager breakfast, Julia walked to a free clinic. She sat stiffly in the worn-out chair, her fingers gripping the hem of her sweater as the doctor spoke. She was pregnant. A cold wave of shock washed over her. As the doctor explained her options, Julia's thoughts spiraled. Should she tell Daniel? Would he take her back? Or would he assume she was trying to manipulate him? That night, she barely slept. By morning, she had made her decision. Daniel Carter didn't deserve to know. This baby was hers, and she would find a way to survive without him. With renewed determination, Julia hit the streets, searching for work. But with no recent experience and unwilling to use Daniel's name as a reference, rejection after rejection wore her down. "I'm sorry," one manager said, his tone regretful, "but we need someone with more experience." Julia nodded, swallowing back the lump in her throat as she stepped out into the cold. As she walked past a bustling cafe, she overheard two women talking. "Did you hear? La Belle is hiring servers. The pay isn't great, but the tips are solid." Hope flickered in Julia's chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Across town, Daniel Carter was operating on a completely different reality. The wealthy CEO stormed through his office, his presence electrifying the air. "I want that deal closed by Friday," he barked at a trembling intern. No excuses. From his office doorway, Marcus Bennett frowned. "You're pushing them too hard, Daniel." Daniel scoffed, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. "This is business, Marcus. If they can't handle it, they don't belong here." Marcus sighed, watching his friend spiral deeper into arrogance. The more powerful Daniel became, the more ruthless he was. He was untouchable, unstoppable. Nothing could stand in his way. Julia, meanwhile, was learning humility. After a grueling interview process, she finally landed a position at La Belle. The hours were long, the work exhausting, but she threw herself into it with everything she had. "You're doing great," the head server encouraged her after a busy shift. For the first time in weeks, Julia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could rebuild her life. "You're doing great," Sarah, the head chef, told Julia after an exhausting shift. A small spark of pride flickered in her chest. It had been weeks since she started working at La Belle, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was standing on her own 2 feet. The morning sickness was brutal, but she pushed through, determined to keep her job. She was finally settling into this new life, finally believing she could do it, until everything changed again. It was a busy Saturday night, and Julia was rushing between tables when she heard a familiar laugh. Her heart stopped. At the corner table sat Daniel and Madison, clinking champagne glasses, laughing as if they had no worries in the world. They looked like the perfect couple. The room spun. Julia's tray wobbled dangerously in her grip. She couldn't breathe. "Julia?" Sarah's voice cut through the fog. She barely managed a small nod before her knees buckled. Sarah caught her just in time. "Let's get you to the back." Julia held her breath as they passed Daniel's table, but he was too engrossed in Madison to notice the commotion. In the kitchen, she collapsed onto a chair, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Sarah rubbed her shoulder. "Don't worry about it. Are you feeling sick? The flu's been going around." Julia nodded, grateful for the excuse, though deep down, she knew the truth. Seeing Daniel again had hurt, but it had also ignited something inside her, a fierce determination. She would survive this, she would thrive, and she would do it all without Daniel Carter. Across town, Daniel paced his office, his phone pressed to his ear. "Listen, Johnson, I need those environmental reports changed. Lower the contamination levels." "But Mr. Carter," the hesitant voice on the other end protested, "that's illegal." "We won't be caught," Daniel snapped. "Just do it. This deal is worth millions." Hanging up, he leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smile spreading across his face. The Riverside Development Project would secure his place among the elite. A few tweaked numbers were a small price to pay for power. Meanwhile, Julia struggled through another shift at La Belle. Her growing belly made maneuvering between tables harder. "Watch it," a customer snapped as she barely avoided spilling water on him. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled, her cheeks burning. As she ducked into the kitchen, she overheard two servers whispering. "How much longer do you think Sarah will keep her? She's slowing down." Julia's hands clenched. She refused to be a victim. Not to Daniel. Not to anyone. Julia's hands trembled as she loaded another tray, the weight feeling heavier than usual. "Just a few feet away," two servers whispered. "How much longer do you think Sarah will keep her? She can barely carry a tray anymore." Her stomach twisted, but she kept her head down. She needed this job. She couldn't afford to lose it now. Across the city, Daniel Carter was having a far better night. The real estate tycoon strode confidently into the conference room, where investors sat eagerly awaiting his presentation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice filled with authority, "I have fantastic news. The environmental reports are in. Riverside is officially ready for development." He painted a vision of luxury condos, high-end shopping centers, and exclusive office spaces. Investors nodded in approval, the promise of wealth gleaming in their eyes. But from the corner of the room, Marcus Bennett remained silent, his brow furrowed. Later, he cornered Daniel in his office. "We need to talk about Riverside." Daniel's smile faded. "What about it?" Marcus shut the door. "I've seen the original reports. I know what you did." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's just business, Marcus. No one's getting hurt." "No one's getting hurt." Marcus's voice rose in disbelief. "What about the families who'll be living on contaminated land? The workers exposed to those chemicals?" Daniel scoffed. "The levels are barely above legal limits. You're overreacting." Marcus slammed a hand on the desk. "This isn't you. What happened to the guy who wanted to make a difference?" Daniel's expression turned cold. "That guy grew up. This is the real world, Marcus. If you can't handle it, maybe you don't belong here." The room fell into tense silence, years of friendship straining under Daniel's ruthless ambition. Meanwhile, Julia faced her own battle at La Belle. As she struggled to carry a particularly heavy tray, she overheard Sarah and the restaurant manager talking in hushed tones. "We can't keep her on much longer," the manager sighed. "She's becoming a liability." Julia's heart sank, but then a strange sense of resolve settled over her. She had faced worse. She could handle this. Squaring her shoulders, she stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside her. "I couldn't help overhearing. I understand your concerns, but I assure you, I can do this job." The manager hesitated. "Miss Carter, we appreciate your effort, but—" "Give me 2 weeks," Julia interrupted. "If I can't keep up, I'll resign. No severance needed." Sarah and the manager exchanged glances. Finally, Sarah nodded. 2 weeks. Julia exhaled, determination burning in her chest. She wasn't going down without a fight. Julia walked away from the conversation, her heart pounding, but for the first time in a long while, she felt something unfamiliar. Strength. She had fought for herself, something she had never done before. Across town, Daniel Carter celebrated his latest victory. The Riverside deal was nearly closed, and he toasted with Madison, reveling in his success. His phone buzzed. It was Marcus. "Daniel, I can't be part of this anymore. I'm resigning." Daniel stared at the message, a mix of frustration and something dangerously close to regret washing over him. But he shoved it aside. He had come too far to start second-guessing himself now. "Your loss," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the table. Madison's eyes flickered with curiosity. "Everything okay, baby?" Daniel forced a smile. "Just fine. Marcus is leaving the company, that's all." Her expression brightened. "Does that mean I can take his office? It has a much better view than mine." Daniel nodded absently, his mind already shifting to the next deal, the next conquest. Later that night, while Daniel slept, Madison crept into his home office. She had noticed him acting secretive lately, locking drawers, setting passwords on his files. Her instincts told her something was off. Her eyes landed on a folder labeled Riverside Confidential. Glancing over her shoulder, she carefully opened it. Her breath hitched. This was big. This could change everything. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. Daniel Carter's empire of glass was about to shatter, and she would be there to pick up the pieces. The next morning she walked into his office, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. "Daniel, darling," she cooed, a coy smile playing on her lips. Daniel barely looked up from his computer. "What is it?" "We need to talk about my new position in the company." His brows furrowed. "New position? What are you talking about?" Her smile sharpened. "Well, with Marcus gone, I think it's time I took on more responsibility. After all," she smoothed a hand over her stomach, "I am carrying your heir." Daniel's expression darkened. "Madison, you're not qualified for Marcus's job." She tilted her head. "Oh, I think you'll find I'm qualified for a lot of things." Sliding the Riverside Confidential folder across his desk, she watched as his face paled. Daniel flipped it open. Inside were the original environmental reports. "Where did you get these?" His voice was low, sharp. Madison shrugged. "Does it matter? What does matter is what I could do with them." A cold sweat broke out along Daniel's forehead. He was cornered. Meanwhile, at LaBelle, Julia was in the middle of another grueling shift. As she rushed to deliver an order, a wave of nausea hit her. Julia stumbled, nearly dropping her tray. Strong hands caught her just in time. "Whoa, careful there," Sarah said from behind her. Julia turned, her face burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I don't know what just happened." Sarah's eyes narrowed, scanning Julia's pale face and the way her hand instinctively rested on her stomach. "Come with me," she said, leading Julia into the break room. Once inside, Sarah crossed her arms. "How far along are you?" Julia's breath hitched. "I what?" "The pregnancy," Sarah said softly. "How far along?" Tears welled in Julia's eyes. "About 3 months," she whispered. To Julia's surprise, Sarah's face softened. "Does the father know?" Julia shook her head, words spilling out before she could stop them. She told Sarah everything, how Daniel had thrown her out, how she had fought to rebuild her life, and how she refused to let him control her future. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Then, to Julia's shock, she pulled her into a hug. "Listen to me," Sarah said fiercely. "You're not alone in this. I've got your back." Julia pulled away, stunned. "Why?" Sarah's eyes darkened with memory. "Because 15 years ago, I was you." As Sarah shared her own story of abandonment, Julia felt a connection forming. For the first time since that stormy night, she didn't feel so alone. Across town, Daniel Carter had his own problems. Madison's threats were becoming more frequent, her demands more unreasonable. "I think I should sit in on the board meeting tomorrow," she announced one evening. Daniel's patience snapped. "Enough, Madison. You are my assistant and the mother of my child, nothing more." Her eyes flashed dangerously. "Careful, Daniel. You wouldn't want certain documents falling into the wrong hands, would you?" As Madison stormed out, Daniel slumped in his chair, rubbing his temples. How had he lost control of everything? The next evening, he decided to clear his head with dinner at LaBelle. He didn't notice Julia ducking behind the bar, her heart hammering in her chest. "Table for one," Daniel told the hostess. Julia peeked around the corner, her breath catching. For a moment, as he sat down, he looked tired, stressed, almost human. A flicker of sympathy crossed her heart. Then she remembered the night he had thrown her out. Her resolve hardened. Sarah appeared at her side. "You okay?" Sarah asked. Julia took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and nodded. I am. He doesn't control my life anymore. Sarah gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. That's my girl. Now, let's get through this shift. I've got a killer chocolate cake recipe to teach you after. As Julia moved through the restaurant, she skillfully avoided Daniel's table. For the first time in a long while, she felt something different. Confidence. She was stronger than before, and most importantly, she wasn't alone. Meanwhile, Daniel stared at his menu without really reading it. His empire was built on unstable ground, and he knew Madison held the power to make it crumble. He needed a plan, fast. As the evening unfolded, Julia and Daniel's paths nearly crossed multiple times. Each near miss sent her heart racing, but she managed to keep her distance. Finally, Daniel left, oblivious to her presence. Julia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Sarah smirked beside her. You did good, kid. Now, about that chocolate cake. Julia followed her into the kitchen, feeling something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could build a new life for herself and her baby. The next evening, Daniel Carter straightened his tie as he entered La Belle. This dinner meeting was crucial. The deal on the table could secure his position as a successful investor, and he needed to be at the top of his game. Mr. Carter, your guests are already seated, the hostess informed him, leading him to a private corner table. As he walked through the restaurant, his sharp eyes swept the room. Then, suddenly, he froze. Across the room, a familiar figure moved between tables, balancing a tray of drinks. Julia. For a moment, Daniel thought his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, it was really her, his ex-wife, and she was unmistakably pregnant. His stomach dropped. Julia was here, working as a waitress and carrying a child. How was this possible? Mr. Carter? One of his dinner guests stood, extending a hand. Is everything all right? Daniel forced himself back to reality, masking his shock with a smooth smile. Yes, of course. Shall we begin? But as the meeting went on, he found it increasingly difficult to focus. His mind kept drifting back to Julia, watching as she worked the room effortlessly, taking orders, balancing trays. Julia, for her part, had noticed Daniel the moment he walked in. Her heart had nearly stopped, but she forced herself to keep working. She wouldn't let him shake her. Not anymore. Julia refused to let Daniel see how much his presence affected her. As the evening progressed, his distraction became painfully obvious. He stumbled through explanations, lost track of his thoughts, and twice nearly knocked over his water glass. Mr. Carter, one of the investors finally said, concern in his voice. Perhaps we should reschedule. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a familiar voice cut in. Daniel, darling, what a surprise. Madison sauntered up to the table, her pregnancy now unmistakable. She placed a possessive hand on his shoulder. I was just meeting some friends for dinner and happened to see you here. Daniel stiffened under her touch. Madison, this isn't a good time. I'm in a meeting. Her smile remained fixed, though her eyes narrowed slightly. Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. As Madison carried on polite conversation with the investors, Daniel's gaze flickered back to Julia. To his shock, she was walking toward their table. Good evening, she said, her voice steady. Can I get you anything else? The table fell silent. Daniel stared at her, a storm of emotions flashing across his face. Shock, guilt, something dangerously close to regret. Madison recovered first. Well, if it isn't the ex-Mrs. Carter. Waiting tables now, are we? How quaint. Julia lifted her chin slightly. I prefer to think of it as honest work, Mrs. Carter, she replied smoothly. Now, can I get you anything, or are you just here to cause a scene? Madison's face darkened, but before she could respond, one of the investors cleared his throat. I'll have another scotch, he said. Julia nodded, ignoring Daniel's attempt to catch her eye. Right away, sir. As she walked away, Daniel felt an unsettling mix of emotions. Pride at her composure, shame at his own actions, and a gnawing unease about the choices he had made. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. The investors left, unimpressed with Daniel's distracted performance. Madison stormed out after a heated, whispered argument. Finally, Daniel sat alone, watching Julia continue her shift. As the restaurant emptied, he found himself walking toward the bar. Julia, he said quietly, can we talk? She turned, her face unreadable. I'm working, Daniel. Some of us have to earn a living. Please, he said, his voice low. Just 5 minutes. Julia sighed. My shift ends in 10. I'll meet you outside. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. When Julia finally stepped outside, Daniel barely recognized her. Gone was the polished socialite. In her place stood a woman who radiated quiet strength. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Daniel blurted, gesturing toward her stomach. Julia's hand instinctively rested on her belly. Would it have made a difference? Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He didn't have an answer. "That's what I thought," Julia said softly. "Goodbye, Daniel." She turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing motionless on the sidewalk, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Unbeknownst to them, Madison sat in her car across the street, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her jaw clenched as she watched Daniel's gaze linger on Julia. "You regret this, don't you, Daniel Carter?" she hissed under her breath. Her fingers hovered over her phone. If she was going down, she was taking him with her. She tapped a folder on her screen labeled Riverside Evidence, then dialed a number. Daniel rushed into his office, his phone ringing nonstop. His assistant intercepted him, her face pale. "Mr. Carter, there's a reporter from the New York Times on line 1. They're asking about Riverside." Daniel's blood ran cold. He snatched the phone. "Carter speaking." "Mr. Carter," the reporter said smoothly, "we've received some interesting documents regarding the Riverside project. Care to comment on the altered environmental reports?" His mind raced. How had they found out? Then it hit him. "Madison." "No comment," he growled, slamming the phone down. Within hours, his world began to unravel. More reporters called. Investors demanded answers. The board of directors scheduled an emergency meeting. Daniel paced his office, barking orders into his phone. "I don't care what it costs. Shut this down. Now." But it was too late. By afternoon, the headlines screamed the scandal across every major news outlet. Carter Enterprises accused of environmental cover-up. His phone buzzed with a text. "Madison should have treated me better." This is just the beginning. As Daniel fought to contain the damage across town, Julia faced her own crisis. She was in the middle of a shift at La Belle when a sharp pain stabbed through her abdomen. Her breath hitched. The tray in her hands crashed to the floor. Sarah was at her side in an instant. "Julia, what's wrong?" Julia clutched her stomach, her face twisted in pain. "Something's wrong with the baby." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm calling an ambulance." At the hospital, doctors rushed Julia into emergency care. Sarah paced the waiting room, feeling helpless. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his office staring at his phone as his empire collapsed around him. Daniel was in the middle of a heated board meeting when his phone buzzed again. He barely glanced at the screen, expecting another reporter, but the name made his breath catch. La Belle. He hesitated before answering. "Mr. Carter, this is Sarah from La Belle. Julia has been taken to Metro General. There are complications with her pregnancy." The world tilted beneath him. "Julia. The baby. His baby." "I have to go," Daniel muttered, standing abruptly. "Daniel, we're not finished here." One of the board members snapped, but he was already out the door. As he sped toward the hospital, chaos swirled in his mind. His carefully built empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. His reputation was in shambles. And now, Julia, the woman he had cast aside, and their unborn child were in danger. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the crushing weight of his choices. The lies, the manipulations, the people he had used to get to the top. What had it all been for? The moment he burst through the emergency room doors, he barely took a breath before rushing to the front desk. "Julia Carter?" he gasped. "Where is she?" "Are you family?" the nurse asked, eyeing him warily. Daniel hesitated. What was he to Julia now? I'm the baby's father." The nurse's expression softened as she pointed to a waiting area. There, he spotted Sarah, her arms crossed as she met his gaze with surprise and anger. "How is she?" he demanded. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "Why do you care? You threw her out, remember?" Daniel flinched at the accusation. "Please," he said quietly. "I need to know." Sarah sighed. "They're still running tests. The doctor suspects preeclampsia. It's serious, Daniel." His stomach dropped. Daniel collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. How had everything gone so wrong? His phone buzzed again, but he ignored it. Nothing mattered except Julia and the baby. Hours crawled by before a doctor finally approached. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "Yes, how are they?" We've stabilized Julia's condition, the doctor said, but she'll need to remain hospitalized for the rest of her pregnancy. The next few weeks are critical. Relief washed over him. Can I see her? The doctor hesitated. She's asking for Sarah. Daniel felt a sharp pang of regret but nodded. He had no right to expect anything from Julia. As Sarah disappeared into Julia's room, Daniel slumped back into his chair. His phone buzzed again. A text from his assistant. Board voting to suspend you pending investigation. Please respond ASAP. Daniel stared at the message, feeling strangely detached. Just days ago, this would have destroyed him. The panic that had consumed Daniel for days now felt meaningless compared to what was happening in that hospital room. For the first time in years, he faced the hollowness of the life he had built. His empire was crumbling, and worse, he might lose the only things that truly mattered. Julia, their child. As he sat in the sterile waiting room, Daniel made a silent vow. If given the chance, he would make things right. Not for his reputation, not for his fortune, for his family. Sitting in his office the next morning, Daniel stared at the clock. In 30 minutes, he had a crucial board meeting, the one that could determine the fate of his company. His phone vibrated non-stop with messages from attorneys, PR teams, and panicked executives. But his mind was elsewhere. A knock on the door jolted him. His assistant peeked inside. Mr. Carter, the board is gathering. They're expecting you in the conference room. Daniel gave a distracted nod and stood, adjusting his tie. His phone buzzed again. Sarah, Julia is asking for you. Without hesitation, Daniel grabbed his coat. Cancel the meeting, he said, striding past his stunned assistant. His phone exploded with calls as he sped to the hospital. He ignored them all. When he arrived, Sarah was outside Julia's room, arms crossed. She's having a rough day, she warned. Be careful what you say. Daniel nodded and stepped inside quietly. Julia lay pale and exhausted against the pillows. The moment she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. Daniel, what are you doing here? You asked for me, he said softly. Julia shook her head. I asked Sarah to keep you updated. I didn't expect you to actually come. Silence settled between them. Daniel stepped closer to the bed. Julia, I'm so sorry for everything. Her eyes filled with unshed tears. Do you even understand what you put me through? Her voice cracked. I lost everything, Daniel. My home, my security, my dignity. I know, he said, voice thick with emotion. I was wrong. I let greed and ambition blind me to what truly mattered. She studied his face carefully. And what matters now? You, he said without hesitation. You and our baby. Nothing else. Julia's hand instinctively went to her stomach. It's not that simple, Daniel, she whispered. You can't just walk back in and expect everything to be okay. I know, he said, and for the first time, he truly meant it. I don't expect forgiveness, Daniel said quietly. I just want a chance to make things right, to be there for you and our child. His phone buzzed again, but he ignored it. Aren't you going to get that? Julia asked. Daniel shook his head. Nothing is more important than this conversation. For the first time, Julia saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. But trusting him again? That was something else entirely. Daniel, I appreciate you being here, she admitted, but I need time. This is all too much, too fast. He nodded. I understand. Whatever you need, I'll be here. Neither of them noticed the storm brewing outside. Across town, Madison sat in a cafe, a satisfied smirk on her lips as she hit send on an email. Attached were all the incriminating documents she had gathered over the years, evidence of Daniel's shady business deals, corruption, and illegal practices. Within hours, the story exploded. Every major news outlet ran exposés on Carter Enterprises' fraudulent activities. Investors panicked. Stocks plummeted. Daniel's empire was collapsing in real time, and he was oblivious to it all, sitting by Julia's bedside. Reality came crashing down when Marcus burst into the hospital room, breathless and panicked. Daniel, Marcus panted, we have a problem. A big one. Daniel frowned. Marcus, what are you doing here? Marcus's expression was grim. Madison leaked everything, Daniel. The files, the reports, the evidence. It's all over the news. The blood drained from Daniel's face. He glanced at Julia, who watched the exchange with wide eyes. How bad is it? He asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. It's bad, Daniel. The SEC is involved. There's talk of criminal charges. Daniel sank into a chair, running a hand down his face. Everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed for was gone. Daniel? Julia's voice was soft, hesitant. "What's going on?" He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and something else, resolve. "My company is falling apart," he admitted. "Everything I worked for, it's over." She studied him for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" Silence stretched between them. Then Daniel reached for her hand. "I'm going to stay right here," he said, "if you'll let me." Julia's eyes widened in surprise. "But your company is just a company," Daniel finished. "I lost sight of what truly matters for too long. I won't make that mistake again." As Daniel sat there holding Julia's hand, a strange sense of peace settled over him. His empire lay in ruins, his reputation was beyond repair, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Marcus watched in silence, emotions flickering across his face. "Daniel," he said finally, "the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're voting to remove you as CEO." Daniel didn't take his eyes off Julia. "Tell them I resign, effective immediately." Marcus hesitated for a moment before nodding and walking away. Daniel turned back to Julia. "I know I have a lot to make up for," he said quietly, "but if you'll give me a chance, I want to be here, for you, for our baby, for our family." Julia, torn between caution and the smallest flicker of hope, squeezed his hand. "One day at a time, Daniel. One day at a time." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Daniel Carter's empire crumbled as investigations into Carter Enterprises intensified. His assets were frozen, partnerships dissolved, and the name that once commanded respect now brought nothing but scandal. Madison disappeared as quickly as she had entered his life, leaving behind nothing but chaos and a note that simply read, "You should have treated me better." Despite everything, Daniel never left Julia's side. He slept in an uncomfortable chair, ate from vending machines, and fielded calls from his lawyers in hushed tones from the hallway. Julia watched him, torn between caution and admiration. The arrogant, ruthless businessman she had once known was gone, replaced by a man who seemed truly committed to change. One morning, as Daniel returned from a coffee run, he found Julia's room in chaos. Nurses rushed around her bed, and her face was twisted in pain. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice sharp with panic. A nurse turned to him. "She's gone into labor. It's too early. We're preparing for an emergency C-section." The world tilted. It was too soon. The baby wasn't due for another month. As they wheeled Julia toward the operating room, she reached for him, gripping his hand. "Don't leave me," she whispered, fear in her eyes. "Never again," Daniel vowed, squeezing her fingers tightly. Inside the operating room, he stood by her side, offering what little comfort he could as the doctors worked. The steady beeping of machines filled the air, urgent voices moving around them. Then, suddenly, the walls of the room seemed to shift, and Daniel was no longer standing there. He was 8 years old again, sitting in the back of his parents' car, the screech of tires, the shatter of glass, the sound of his entire world collapsing. The terrifying silence stretched on. Daniel shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. He couldn't break now. Julia needed him. "Stay with me, Julia," he urged, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the strongest person I know. You can do this." Her grip on his hand tightened as another contraction hit. "I'm scared, Daniel," she admitted. "I know," he whispered, "but I'm right here. We're in this together." As the doctors worked, Daniel felt something shift inside him, a protectiveness so fierce it almost knocked the air from his lungs. This was his family. He had already failed them once. He wouldn't do it again. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a tiny cry broke through the tension. Daniel's heart leapt. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, holding up a small, wrinkled bundle. But the joy was short-lived. The baby's cries were weak. Within seconds, the medical team whisked him away. "What's wrong?" Julia's voice was laced with panic. "Why isn't he with me?" The doctor's expression was grave. "He's having trouble breathing. We need to get him to the NICU immediately." As the door swung open and the team rushed out, Daniel hesitated. He wanted to follow his son, but he couldn't leave Julia. "Go," she said, sensing his inner battle. "Go with our baby. Make sure he's okay." Daniel pressed a kiss to her forehead before hurrying after the medical team. Inside the NICU, he stood helplessly as doctors and nurses worked on his fragile son. Tubes and monitors surrounded the tiny infant, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Daniel felt something inside him crack. All the walls he had built, All the emotional distance he had carefully maintained collapsed in an instant. Tears slid down his face as he placed a trembling hand on the incubator. "Hey, little guy," he whispered. "I'm your dad." His voice broke. "I know I messed up before you got here, but I promise, I'm going to do better. I just need you to keep fighting, okay?" Hours blurred together as Daniel shuttled between the NICU and Julia's hospital room, giving updates and offering what little comfort he could. Despite her own recovery, Julia insisted on being wheeled to the NICU the moment she was able. When she saw their son for the first time, she broke down. "He's so small," she sobbed. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "But he's strong," he assured her. "Just like his mom." As they stood there watching their son fight for his life, something else happened. The distance between them began to fade. And for the first time in a long time, they weren't just two people bound by the past. They were a family. The walls between them slowly crumbled, replaced by something stronger, a shared love for their son. Days turned into weeks. Their baby grew stronger. First, he was taken off the ventilator, then out of the incubator. Finally, Julia held him for the first time. As Daniel watched her cradle their son, an overwhelming sense of peace washed over him. His once powerful empire was gone, his reputation shattered, but none of that mattered. Everything that truly mattered was right here in this room. "What should we name him?" Julia asked, looking up at him. Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "How about Michael? After my father." A small smile played on Julia's lips. "Michael Carter? I like it." Sitting together, a family at last, Daniel knew this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. He had a long road ahead to make up for his mistakes, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. With Julia and Michael by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Daniel Carter stood before the judge, his lawyer at his side. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every seat, eager to witness the downfall of one of New York's most notorious businessmen. "Mr. Carter," the judge's voice rang out, "given your cooperation and lack of prior criminal record, the court is prepared to accept your plea deal." Daniel stood motionless as the judge continued. "You will serve no jail time. However, you must complete 2,000 hours of community service and pay a substantial fine. Do you accept these terms?" Daniel nodded solemnly. "I do, Your Honor." As he left the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, shouting questions. He ignored them. His mind was already on where he truly needed to be, the hospital, where Julia and Michael were waiting. When he arrived, Julia sat beside their son's crib, watching over him. "How did it go?" she asked. "No jail time," Daniel replied, exhaling. "But I have a lot of community service ahead of me." Julia nodded, her attention drifting back to Michael. "He's getting stronger every day," she whispered. Daniel stepped closer, resting a hand on the crib. "Hey, little guy," he murmured. "Dad's here." Over the next few weeks, Daniel split his time between the hospital and his court-mandated community service. He was assigned to teach entrepreneurship to at-risk youth in low-income neighborhoods. At first, he felt out of place. To them, he was just another fallen millionaire husband, a rich man forced to be there. But as he shared his knowledge of business and finance, he saw something shift, a spark of curiosity in their eyes. One day, for the first time in his life, Daniel Carter realized something. Success wasn't about power or money. It was about the lives you changed along the way. Daniel Carter had built an empire. From a young age, he had been ruthless in his pursuit of wealth. Success, power, and influence were all that mattered. He had everything: a luxurious penthouse, a fleet of cars, and a thriving business empire that commanded respect in New York's corporate world. But with all his success, he had failed at the one thing that truly mattered: his family. Julia, the woman who had once been the love of his life, had been cast aside when she no longer fit into his vision of perfection. His hunger for power had blinded him to the damage he was causing, to his marriage, to himself, and to the future he never imagined he would want. Now, as he stood in a hospital room, watching their newborn son fight for his life in an incubator, he realized he had been chasing the wrong kind of success all along. For weeks, Daniel balanced between two worlds. By day, he fulfilled his court-mandated community service, forced to teach at-risk youth about business and finance. By night, he sat by Julia's bedside, watching their son slowly grow stronger. At first, he had resisted the idea of community service. The students in the program didn't trust him. To them, he was nothing more than a fallen millionaire husband, a man who had once been untouchable, but now had to pay for his mistakes. But as the weeks passed, Daniel saw something he had never noticed before. These kids had dreams, just like he once did. But unlike him, they didn't have opportunities. No investors were waiting to fund their ideas. No one was mentoring them. One day, a teenager named Jamal hesitated before approaching him. "Mr. Carter, I have this idea for a business, but I don't know how to start." Daniel spent an hour with Jamal, going over his plan, giving him strategies and motivation. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had never experienced in the corporate world: fulfillment. That night, he shared the experience with Julia. "These kids have so much potential," he told her, his voice filled with something she hadn't heard in a long time: passion. "They just need someone to believe in them." Julia watched him carefully. "You're different," she finally said. "Yeah," he admitted, "I think I am." Even as Daniel tried to prove he had changed, Julia wasn't ready to forgive him just yet. She had spent too many nights crying over the man he used to be, too many days struggling to survive after he threw her out. "I want to forgive you," she admitted one night as they sat beside their son. "But I'm scared." Daniel didn't rush her. He knew trust wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn. "I understand," he said softly. "I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm not that man anymore." And for the first time, Julia believed he meant it. Day by day, their relationship began to heal. They weren't a couple again, not yet, but they were learning to co-parent, to trust, to rebuild what was broken. Then one afternoon, Julia's phone rang. It was Sarah from La Belle, the restaurant where Julia had once worked before her life had fallen apart. "Julia, I've been thinking," Sarah said. "When you're ready to come back, how would you feel about running our new pastry program?" Julia's breath caught. For months she had felt lost, unsure of what her future held. Now for the first time she saw a path forward. "Sarah, I'd love that." Daniel had one final test to prove who he had become. One day an old business associate approached him with an opportunity, a chance to reclaim a multi-million-dollar investment deal, one that would put him back on top. It was tempting. But when he looked across the hospital room where Julia sat with Michael in her arms, he knew power and money didn't define him anymore. He turned down the deal. And in that moment, Julia knew. He wasn't the same man who had once walked away from his family. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Maybe we could start over." Daniel reached for her hand. "I'd like that." For the first time in years, he felt truly rich. This story teaches us that no matter how lost you are, change is possible. Daniel was once a selfish millionaire husband, but through loss, love, and redemption, he became a better man. What do you think? Can people truly change, or do some mistakes last forever? Comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful life lessons and incredible real-life stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.